Thanks for coming out this afternoon on a chilly Monday afternoon. At least it's not raining. We're really honored this all day today to have Adrian Fine come visit us and this afternoon be part of our college lecture series. Many of you have already met him in various courses through the day, but for those who haven't, Adrian is a CAP grad in urban planning from 1992 and one of the early recipients of a minor in historic preservation. So he crossed over into two of our departments early in his career. His early interest in community and neighborhood planning and neighborhood advocacy, he started his preservation work early on with Indiana Landmarks. And for those who aren't aware, Indiana Landmarks is a statewide non-for-profit that focuses on preservation of historic buildings and sites, also works a lot with community investment and the concept of reconnecting people with heritage. He was a field coordinator for Landmarks for about 6 years before he left and started working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, so taking the idea of advocacy and nonprofits to a national level. Started as a field office, Northeast field office director, and ultimately became the director of the Center for the State and Local Policy. After his work with the National Trust, he flew to the other side of the United States and ultimately landed in California, where he's been for the last about 15 years or so, working with the Los Angeles Conservancy. So the Los Angeles Conservancy is an historic preservation not-for-profit serving 88 cities and a variety of unincorporated areas in LA County, about 4,000 square miles, in which they work advocating for preservation, history, and heritage. As the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy, Adrian oversees the organization's leadership within the greater Los Angeles region. And now, if I understand correctly, the LA Conservancy is the largest local not-for-profit membership-based heritage conservation organization in the United States. He's the past president of the Board of Trustees for the California Preservation Foundation, chairs and currently chairs their advocacy committee. He's the founding member of the Southern California chapter of DocoMoMo, which is the documentation and conservation of the modern movement. He teaches in a variety of ways. He teaches at University of Southern California's Heritage Conservation Program, the National Alliance for Preservation Commission's CAMP program, and the Getty Conservation Institute's Conserving Modern Architecture initiative. Today, Adrian's joined us talking about some of the issues that historic preservation and climate are facing in Los Angeles, in particular with the fires that we've all been reading and hearing about that have happened in Los Angeles over the past few months. And he posed an interesting question, which I'm looking forward to the answer to. Is preservation positioned and poised to meet the current moment, or are we losing ground and need to regroup and redefine what preservation means to ensure we remain relevant? So please join me in welcoming Adrian Fine to Ball State.
Great. Can you hear me all? Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. It's really nice being back in this space. And not taking some test or something that is, trauma-inducing, but nice to be back here. So, as Jonathan said, I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, and he already gave you kind of the background. This is my migratory pattern professionally in terms of coming from the Midwest to the East Coast to the West Coast. And what I will say, without getting lots of different organizations I've worked with, in preservation and heritage conservation, I use them interchangeably. They work in different ways from what I was doing here versus what I'm doing now in Los Angeles. But I will say now, this moment that we're in, I feel like this work has never been more important in terms of why heritage conservation matters, why we need to do this work, and also there's huge challenges ahead. And I think you'll probably see some of those as we go into this. This just again is the organization, the LA Conservancy, and we were formed in the 70s like a lot of groups. a staff of around 17, and a big area that we serve in terms of Los Angeles County. It's massive in terms of its size and what we do. And this is kind of I would say, part of what we are looking at, what we're always talking about. If there's two things I would say on this list to remember, one is that our philosophy is that we are managing, we're not stopping change. Despite all the perceptions of what preservation and heritage conservation is about, that's really how we approach it, is how do we manage change, which is fundamentally what I came here for around planning. So it's planning, preservation planning. And the other piece to that is the bottom here is meeting people where they're at. And I'll hopefully illustrate lots of examples of how we do that in working with communities in lots of different ways, but it's really that. And then you see lots of other things in terms of what we're dealing with. It's very complicated in terms of these projects. It's politically challenged, to say the least, and we say win-win almost like it should be a drinking game. It's always like, how do we get to the win-win in terms of what we're trying to achieve? And then these are really the main aspects I'm going to cover in talking about lots of different things, not just one thing, in terms of, again, kind of the people plus places or people-centric focus. Talk a lot about cultural relevance and what does that look like in terms of the work that we're doing in Los Angeles. Give you a little bit of a flavor of the types of places that we're dealing with is mostly mid-century, modern era places, and that presents its own unique challenges. And then talk about things obviously like the LA wildfires, but also the other issue that we're dealing with and is a huge priority for our organization is the housing, and which should be a concern for everybody in the US, but it manifests itself in different ways across the country. And then I'll end lastly on this question of why, and it's really a question for you, but you'll see that. This just gives you an illustration. Again, everything we are is about people. And that's kind of contradictory to what most people think heritage conservation is. You only care about old buildings. We actually care about the people that care about the old buildings, and how do we help them in terms of what they are trying to do, what stories they're trying to tell through historic places. And we're working with all kinds of community groups, all kinds of languages, and places that maybe are not necessarily on the radar of traditional historic preservation, including, in this case, a group of women that are talking about the women's building that is all about history that happened in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, and why this place is so important in terms of their story, their contribution as women artists. And you'll see that in just some of the examples across the city and how we do that. And so I will illustrate that as we go. I always like this image because I think it illustrates in some ways kind of our ethos in terms of the work of the LA Conservancy, is that how do we help people see themselves in the places that we can serve? And these three images from P-Town, from Philadelphia, and from Manhattan Beach, vastly different places. The one thing they all have in common is women. It's the women's stories connected to these places, and that's often the story that's left off. In this particular case, they're so overt in terms of putting the women's faces on the buildings to drive home the point in terms of their contributions and acknowledge, in terms of women's associations with historic places. And that's often one of the places in terms of being left off, in terms of telling the full story. We have a new initiative that we're working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation on. It's called the LA Women's Landmarks Initiative, and it's essentially to raise the needle or move the needle in terms of the number of places that are being recognized for women's heritage. And so that's one very discrete initiative that we're working on right now. The other piece to this one is it's very personal in terms of when we're talking about community groups that care about places, this idea lets us tell stories about ourselves, or this is my landmark, very personal in terms of people have connection to these places, or my friend Dimitri here wanting a picture in front of this wonderful brutalist building at UC San Diego. It's very personal in terms of the work that we do, and so it's again driving home this idea of people plus places. Or on the left here, a very nondescript building in Los Angeles is the Japanese hospital, and helping this community group to achieve both local designation as well as National Register designation to tell the story about a building that tells their story of the Japanese American community having to fight all the way up to the US Supreme Court to get access to have health care. That's a powerful story that's wrapped up in a really kind of nondescript building, but really important in terms of telling that story and recognizing it. Or again, this is the building with the group of women I showed earlier in terms of the women's building, about LA artists coming together, women artists by and for themselves in terms of having access to show art, to demonstrate at a time when that was not possible in traditional kind of male-oriented LA art scenes at the time. Who knew? And then a lot, again, how do we equip community groups? How do we help people do this work? We have a community leadership boot camp as one of the things to allow people to understand how to use the tools, planning tools, preservation tools, whatever it may be, whatever you care about, what places matter to you, and then how do we help get you there? We're also, as Jonathan was saying, redefining what we believe heritage is and talking more about intangible heritage, not just the bricks and mortar types of places, but also the places within. Maybe historic buildings or maybe not historic. Things like legacy businesses, and we're defining a legacy business in LA, a business anywhere from 20 years or older. So it's these mom and pop shops that give us those kind of community anchors. They're places that we rely on, we love in terms of our neighborhoods, and if we lose those, it's an intangible heritage aspect that is also valuable. So we're doing things like we encourage the city of LA to pass a new legacy business program similar to what San Francisco did and a number of other cities across the country. LA put $5 million into the program, providing small loans, grants for legacy businesses. We also did a grant program with Wells Fargo. So in some ways we're talking about economic development. We're developing a toolkit for the city of LA right now, talking about business succession planning, employee-owned models, things that never thought I'd be talking about in preservation, but again, this is an important, valuable asset as well in terms of heritage. And then we're also asking questions in terms of the work that we're doing and always assessing, are we meeting the moment in terms of things like, can we be doing better in terms of the work that we're doing around cultural relevance, and I'll show you some examples of that, but also again, how relevant are we to the broader community in terms of do people care and does this work matter? And I will say, I would say even more so nowadays than any time in terms of things that are happening at the federal level and that are trickling down to the states and to the local level, even in California, it's asking questions about this. How well do the systems and structures that we've been relying upon, how well do they work for this? The example on the left with the Chicano moratorium marches, they happened in Los Angeles, in East Los Angeles in '69 and '70. And we worked to have them recognized on the National Register of Historic Places. It took us 5 years to get the Park Service to be able to find a way, a mechanism for those places to be honored and acknowledged. If it took us 5 years, think about a community group that's also wanting to have their history or their story being told and how hard sometimes the systems either work or work against us. So asking these kinds of questions about how well these, the work that we're doing isn't meeting the moment in terms of relevancy. If you haven't checked out the relevancy guidebook from Landmarks Illinois, I would definitely encourage you to check it out, download it. It's a PDF. Bonnie McDonald, their CEO, worked on this project, and it's asking a number of these same questions that we're infiltrating in terms of, or we're integrating in terms of the work that we're doing. And one of the things that she did in terms of preparing this guidebook was asking communities these 4 questions about heritage conservation or preservation in terms of, do we just need some incremental systematic change to make it work better? Is it a communications problem? Do we just need some tweaking? And then maybe it's full anarchy, let's scrap the whole thing and start all over again. And usually when I ask this question of people, it's one of the first 3. They say, okay, it works okay, but we need some fixes. Not completely overhaul, but it is one of the fundamental questions that we're looking at. And here's a good example of that in terms of, are we telling the full story or are we telling kind of the pretty story and leaving off the really important part? So on the left is architect Paul Revere Williams, who's kind of LA's hometown architect, significant nationally in terms of African-American architect, beloved in terms of his work. Usually the story that's told about him is about the work that he was designing, fancy homes from the 1930s all the way into the 1950s for famous stars in LA, in Palm Springs and whatnot. The story that often isn't told is his story as a person, as a black architect, and his own experience, and how was he able to achieve the acclaim that so many others did not. This was an initiative that we did a few years back in partnership with the National Organization of Minority Architects, or NOMA, to tell a broader story about him, not just the story that you always hear, but the full story. And to tell that story, you have to talk about this house. This is the house he lived in for 30 years in the Exposition Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. And it's a very simple craftsman style house from the teens, nothing special. He did not design this house, but this is where he lived. And so when this came up for redevelopment, we said, no, that's really important for telling his full story in terms of his experience. And in part of that, it's this quote from him. This was a piece he wrote in '37 talking about his experience as a black architect and living at this house. He did some of his most prolific work while he was living in this house, not by choice, but due to redlining, racial restrictive covenants. This is where he lived. So when this was at risk for redevelopment and demolition, that prompted us and community group to come together to have it designated as a historic cultural monument, not for its architecture, for its cultural significance. And we were successful in doing that. And then we were successful in finding a buyer to take on this project, and it's currently being restored. And the buyer is an architect that was moved and wanted to honor Paul Revere Williams' legacy by making sure that this house would be rehabilitated and retained. So again, telling his full story. So that's where we're working more around cultural relevance versus necessarily, similarly focused just on architecture. And then if you look at the numbers, this is an audit that we did in Los Angeles. We have about 35 local historic districts spread across the city of many hundreds of buildings. And then we have about 1,300 or a little more than 1,300 individual local landmarks. So this is the breakdown. And you can get the sense of how much is it telling the full story of a place like Los Angeles, where we have everybody that could possibly be there in terms of history and cultures and backgrounds, and understanding that most of it is very architecture and male white centric. So how do we move the needle to tell broader stories in terms of the work that we're doing around this? And this works.
You can read about things in books or see videos, but having someplace, something about touching a building or seeing how it really looked, it can spur your imagination and it can deepen your understanding about the significance, and hopefully that's what it does. People need to know where we came from, and LGBT people need to know this is one of the first places where people were brave enough to stand up. I get emotional about this. There's a natural human disposition to focus in on the star-studded places, the Stonewall Inn, which certainly deserves its designation as a national monument. Hopefully people will realize that the LGBT movement came about all across the country. It had humble origins, just like all of the other civil rights movements of the 1960s. It was not in fancy, big places. It started out, this was a working class bar at that time, and that's where it started. That's the origin of people's rights today. It came from places like this.
I always say Wes says it a lot better than I could ever in terms of why places like this matter. Again, goes back to people and places, but also extraordinary stories contained within very ordinary looking places that we drive by and take for granted if we don't do the digging to understand what actually might be contained or connected to these places. I'm going to shift a little bit related to that, but also give you a flavor of more of some of the work that we're doing around modernism, and same era in many cases in terms of the history, but also the architecture, and this big question for us, especially in a place where so much was being built all across the country, but specifically in a place like Los Angeles during this era, and how do we set priorities for deciding what to keep, what to let go of in terms of this era, and also understanding, in my experience working in this field for a while, most historic places, or places that potentially are historic, are most at risk between ages 30 and 55. This is a time when they're starting to look a little dated, they're not yet fully appreciated, they haven't had the upkeep, and look, they need some maintenance, kind of like us as individuals during the same age group. So I'm right in that zone, or really right on the edge of that zone, and not the good place in terms of the age bracket here. But it makes sense. These are people, places that people are not yet appreciating in terms of what might be historic. The Conservancy has been working in the modern era way before most places across the country. We started in 1984 in terms of initially it was a 1950s task force that then turned into our Modernism Committee, or MOGCOM, this kind of ragtag group of folks that were advocating for places well before anybody was thinking about them being important, let alone historic. And that's what we continue doing. This is an early example, and I'll illustrate what's happening here on the right, because you may not know exactly what's going on here. So this is the 1953, what is now the world's oldest McDonald's in Downey, California, just a little south of Los Angeles in LA County. And let me give you a little context here. For those that don't know, McDonald's, when it started off, had this type of building you'll see in the next slide, but it had a different mascot. You had Speedy the chef. So hopefully some of you remember Speedy the chef. Speedy got replaced at some point with Ronald McDonald. So this is our Modernism Committee doing a little bit of street theater to get some attention and get the media to pay attention about why this old McDonald's was important, and this was happening in 1994. So you have Ronald McDonald stabbing Speedy in the back, and then you have the McDonald's corporate type holding the coffin, and this was to illustrate again McDonald's tearing down the old building because they want to build their new franchise. And McDonald's Corporation hated this. The media loved it. So it got lots of good attention. It achieved the mission in terms of getting McDonald's to come to the table. We saved the building. It's there today. It now has a McDonald's museum as part of it. It is now one of the most profitable franchises within the McDonald's big list of franchise stores around the country, and they now claim it as part of their heritage. So things can happen. People can turn around and look at places differently than what they looked at them before. And what we have found when we have threatened places from the 50s or 60s, whether it's a googie bowling alley like this, people have connections to these places. They come out in full force. They want to see them preserved. They want to find a reuse for them in terms of that. Same goes for a googie coffee shop. And does everyone know what googie is when I say googie? So googie is a very type of architecture style in Los Angeles, and it's all about bold geometric forms. It's all about attracting attention. Built in the 50s and 60s, it was all about trying to get the people driving by on the commercial strips to pull over, spend some money, and these are beloved buildings scattered throughout Los Angeles. And it also brings up issues. This is a kind of a weakness in preservation. We can save a building, but we may not be able to save the use. And so norms, we have now protected it. It's saved in terms of the physical structure, but now the norms, the business inside is still at risk. And community has come out in force again, saying they want to keep that. This example illustrates what we're often dealing with is moments of transition when places are changing ownership, and that's when they're most at risk. So this is CBS Television City. It was the first television factory, essentially, from the early 1950s. Significant architecture, but I think it's more significant and culturally in terms of this is where All in the Family happened. This is where Carol Burnett's show happened. So seminal moments in television history happen within these four walls of this building. When we knew CBS was going to sell it, We worked with them and finally got their approval and support to have it designated. What we did not anticipate, we wanted to make sure it was protected for the next owner, but we did not anticipate the next owner would come forward with this, to build a massive new building on top of the already massive historic building. And we're like, okay, didn't see that coming. So it took another year working with a studio developer, to say that's not a great idea for preservation in terms of keeping the historic building. And like I said, we look for win-wins wherever possible. It meant that we then need to better understand what are the studio needs, what is an optimal studio stage size, why do they need so much office space to help support studios, and also we want to support studios because that's really important to economic development in Los Angeles. So this is ultimately what we've ended up with. Imperfect, but better than where we started. There's no longer a big building on top of the historic building. We have a tower to the side. We have a rooftop one-story addition pushed back to the very far, but that took us a year of negotiations to get to this point. And that's where we're at now, and maintaining that view shed so you still see that building in that iconic red canopy. In terms of that, some specific challenges that we deal with is high price of dirt or real estate in Los Angeles that is egregious in terms of what we experience and how do you make the economics work. And it's even worse when you have a view. So here's a Richard Neutra designed tiny, tiny house that was very much at risk. This is the view from that house. So you can imagine what someone wanted to do in terms of demolishing this house and building something bigger. The win-win in this particular case is the house is preserved. They are building an addition which is bigger than the house behind it. But that's the best we can do in terms of achieving that kind of win-win in terms of preservation. But these are big forces that work against us in terms of that. And it's also that we're working to save places multiple times. Even this place, Cinerama Dome in Hollywood, some of you might know it well. And this illustrates a place that was very young of age when it was at risk in the early 1990s. We worked to save it and make sure the new development was pushed back from it. It's now at risk again. It's closed, been closed for the last 5 years. It's designated and protected, but now we're working on how do we get it reopened in terms of a new use. So we're always working on these places in terms of that. And I always like this quote from Catherine. I think it illustrates much of what we're about and why the work that we do at the Conservancy and other groups like Indiana Landmarks or the National Trust, we play the long game in terms of changing perceptions, awareness, mindsets, and also our own. The way I look at buildings today is very different than I looked at some of the same buildings 20 years ago. And I think everybody in this room probably can look at that as well. You know, we look at places differently when we understand them. And that's part of our job through education and advocacy to change perceptions. This is one example of that. When the 1960s were coming of age, turning around 50 years of age, we're like, okay, let's mount a campaign to get people to understand why 1960s buildings and places and stories are important. So we did a When the 60s Turn 50 campaign to raise awareness, and now we don't have to fight so much for the 1960s. People get them, they say, okay, yeah, it's historic. Now we're talking about the 1970s, and we did a similar campaign, also raising awareness, appreciation about this era of places, and we're working there. I wouldn't say people are all ready to embrace the 1970s yet, but we're getting there. This is our earliest building, or youngest building that we've advocated for, a 1979 building by John Lautner. We were successful, and it has been adaptively reused in terms of its use. We have an easement conservation program, so this is a 1972 building, glass skin building, very significant building. When the federal government was selling this through GSA, we took a conservation easement and then worked with a new developer in terms of them taking over ownership, and then the entire envelope of the building has been restored as part of that project. Buildings protected in perpetuity as part of that. And then if we go back to when I was talking about earlier, telling the full story, Pacific Design Center, West Hollywood, 3 buildings. It's the blue building, it's the green building, it's the red building. Postmodern, if you love it or hate it, it is what it is. 2 of the buildings are locally landmarked, the blue and the yellow, or the blue and the green. However, when we often hear the story of the Pacific Design Center, it's about Pele, and not not knocking Pelly in any way in terms of his contribution to the Pacific Design Center, but it's not the full story. If you tell the full story of the Pacific Design Center, it's also Pelly and Norma in terms of her contribution. She helped design the Blue Building, or the Blue Whale, often as it's referred to as well. And so it's, again, making sure that we are telling and we're acknowledging everybody that's involved in these places when we talk about saving them or reusing them in terms of preservation. And I could spend an entire day just talking about the saga attached to this particular building when we were talking about telling the full story. This was Parker Center, or what originally was the 1955 Police Facilities Building for Los Angeles. It's significant modernist building, Welton Beckett, but it came about through urban renewal in Little Tokyo, tore down a lot of things that people loved, and it's also mired in a police chief that was anything but beloved and has a lot of stories attached to police brutality of various disenfranchised communities across Los Angeles. So when this building was in the headlines in terms of, do we keep it, do we let it go, we were one of the few organizations that were advocating for keeping it and recontextualizing and telling its story through preservation and adaptive reuse. The short story, we were not successful. It was demolished, but it does raise this question of, so we didn't acknowledge that story, we haven't dealt with that story, it's now a vacant lot still today, and if there's any irony here, the council member that championed the demolition, he's now in jail. Because fraud and other kinds of abuse. So, that's where we're at in terms of that. But it does bring up this question about erasure and what do we gain from that? And a similar story, almost exactly the same story, is playing out right now in the city of Philadelphia with their former police headquarters, the Roundhouse. Same narrative around urban renewal, police brutality, love it or hate it, modernist architecture, and a city that is definitely right now not poised to do preservation, and a community that is saying, please reuse this really significant modernist building, and let's tell the full story about what it represents to the community, whether that happens or not. I'm going to shift now to, when I say relevance, the work that we do, 2 issues that we're focused in on in terms of asking this question. Is preservation or heritage conservation in Los Angeles, in Muncie, in LA, Indianapolis, wherever, are we being relevant to addressing the concerns and issues that people care about? One of those is around housing, especially around affordable housing. And the second issue is how we're dealing with the LA wildfires. We have launched an initiative or campaign called Home, looking at the housing issue in Los Angeles. And our goal is to make it very clear what is the nexus between preservation and housing. And it's often presented to us when we're advocating in one way or another, saying, well, it's an either or. Either you can do affordable housing, or then you have to do preservation. And I think that is a false choice. It's a both and. You can do both. It's about being creative about doing that. It's not mutually exclusive. And we're also dealing with especially state legislation that is increasingly telling us how we cannot do preservation in a place like Los Angeles or San Francisco or across the state. It's much different, and every legislative cycle it's changing in terms of that. So it's hugely complicated in terms of this issue. And it's raising questions about how do you add density, all the things we talk about in planning, how do you add density to older and sometimes historic neighborhoods or existing neighborhoods? How do you do that in a way that is complementary? How do you do it with a scalpel or surgical versus blunt? This, I would say, is a little more blunt in terms of its approach of adding multifamily and raising the big question. And I can't think of probably a state that's more divisive in terms of this question about YIMBY, NIMBY discussions. Where do you fall? And where they try to put us, especially heritage conservation work, I think we actually are in the MIMBY category, the maybe in my backyard, depending on the situation. But we are working with YIMBY organizations who are very well-funded and active across the state, including Los Angeles. This was a bill that we actually were a part of with Assemblymember Matt Haney in terms of last year about housing to or commercial to housing conversions, about the office vacancy, and how do we streamline those kinds of projects so that they can be more quicker, but also more cost effective in terms of that. But this is very much of our focus. And like I was saying before, it's also understanding how did we get here. This problem is decades and decades in the making. So understanding this was a study recently done that helps break that out in terms of what was happening to what communities, what's your lived experience when you're talking about housing. It's very different depending on who you are, and that's part of this understanding in terms of this. This is one of the key challenges. So Los Angeles alone, by 2029, if we meet what the state says under our regional housing needs assessment, we have to create 456,000 new housing units. That's a big, massive number. There's no way we're going to meet that, but we have to show that the land use and the zoning can accommodate that. So most recently, we upzoned the entire city, and then that brought up this whole question of single family versus multifamily, and there's a massive divide there, especially within the YIMBY, NIMBY communities. So that's part of our landscape that we're working within when we're talking about housing. The other piece of this argument is when you're talking about housing, it's often focused on production alone. Build, build, build. That's how we solve the problem. And there's no way you could build enough affordably to meet the need. In Los Angeles, but really across California, to do a subsidized affordable housing unit, it's anywhere between 600,000 to $1 million, depending on where you're at, for one unit. So it's massive amounts of dollars that increasingly are less and less available in which to do that. So we're also making the case, well, why are we just focused on production? Let's also retain, reinvest, rehabilitate our existing affordable housing, which is mostly contained within older and historic buildings across the city. We know that, but we're losing those buildings to build new buildings. And this is kind of the rub. It's kind of this zero-sum game of adding and subtracting, but we're only counting what we're producing and not paying attention to what we're subtracting in terms of people being displaced, communities being destabilized. So it's hugely complicated in terms of this issue, but we want to be at the table so that we can help in terms of this issue. And you see how it plays out in terms of different communities, neighborhoods being transformed. I wouldn't say this is very innovative infill housing on the example here, but that's what you're seeing in some neighborhoods, these refrigerator boxes going up, it's increasing density, but not much more than that. This is a study we did a few years back looking at this issue and beyond. I'd encourage you to check it out on our website, download it as a PDF. But you see some of these weird examples like this. That's not a great solution to the housing, and that's not great for heritage conservation. Might as well just tear the little house down rather than have it surrounded by all of that. So trying to find better solutions, again, working with lots of community groups that are desperately wanting to find better ways of doing this. No one's against housing or more housing or affordable housing, but we need a better approach about how this plays out in a city. And we're also leaning on things where we know we do the job well. We have a long track record around adaptive reuse across the country. In the city of Los Angeles, just in the downtown alone, we've created over 12,000 new housing units through really the kind of the landmark adaptive reuse ordinance program that was passed in 1999. And so part of our job is looking at those tools that we already have, how do we make them work better? So we just passed a new citywide adaptive reuse ordinance that now applies across the city. It's more flexible, it's focused more on housing, especially around the office to residential conversion. So looking at new tools in terms of that. And these are really the three components to what we're focused in about kind of our home campaign, adaptive reuse, the naturally occurring affordable housing, or really it's the naturally disappearing affordable housing, existing older and historic housing. And then the last piece was around how do we do infill housing better, kind of gentle density in terms of that. So those are our focus, and we're doing lots of different programs and engaging different groups and talking with partners that traditionally we haven't done. So talking with housing nonprofits and other groups that are working in the housing arena around this. And then that gets us to the fires. So if our housing crisis wasn't bad enough, it's now exponentially much more of a crisis than it ever was before. So the fire started on January 7th, and we have been actively involved in the response since then in lots of different ways, and I'll give you kind of a snapshot of what that looks like, but also put it in context. What do the fires mean, and what do they actually look like? So again, it's about 37,000 acres in size between the two major fires. We had about 5 different fires happening in that week, but there's 2 fires that did the predominant damage. And if you look at the total number of acres in the county of Los Angeles, it's about 1.4% completely decimated, and about 16,000 buildings in terms of that. And if you look at it in terms of the 2 fires here, both the Palisades and the Eaton fires, in terms of the breakdown, the other piece to this is that makes it even more complicated. The Palisades is in the city of Los Angeles. The Eaton fire is in unincorporated Los Angeles County. 2 different jurisdictions, 2 different responses, 2 very different types of communities in terms of demographics and access to wealth and whatnot and resources, which means 2 wildly different responses overall in terms of what we're looking at. And then to give you some more context, the size of the fire in comparison to like things, the Great Chicago Fire gives you a better sense of just how large this actually was in terms of geography. And also understanding that we're not immune, and this isn't the first time we've had a wildfire, but we've never had a wildfire like this in terms of the size, the veracity, the extent of the damage, in terms of just the sheer number of structures that were impacted. But certainly we've had other wildfires, and we will have wildfires again. So it's bringing up questions about how do we rebuild in a fire resilient way, and how do we adapt existing buildings so they have a greater chance of survival for the next wildfire. So it's all about climate change and dealing with changing conditions. This is what the vast majority of both of the fire burn areas looks like. So you just have chimneys standing, not much more than that, which we initially thought we would have more damaged buildings that we could be helpful with in terms of bringing structural engineers and architects in to help. We have probably a dozen total of buildings that fall into that category. So it's raising questions more about, for us, early on, about how we responded. Initially, it was about calculating, understanding, documenting what was impacted and what was lost, but also working to talk about what heritage matters, what heritage was impacted through this horrific natural disaster in lots of different ways. And this was playing out certainly within that full first week, but it continues to happen in terms of people talking about why these places matter. And now there's even a more profound sense of this than before in terms of people realizing what was lost that they didn't know about beforehand. And so it's kind of, we take heritage for granted. These are just an example of some of the places that were specifically lost. There are many, so it ranges from architecturally significant to legacy businesses to community serving, general stores, whatever it might be, lots of really important places. It was also incredibly random. So as we're doing documentation, you can never just count off an area completely as being lost, because you could have a house completely untouched next to another house or a block of everything that's completely gone. It was very random in terms of how the fire worked and what was saved and what wasn't in terms of this. In some cases, the people that were not damaged or destroyed, they're now feeling like it's even worse because they don't have access to the same resources. And we're talking about toxic materials that have infiltrated all of those buildings that had to be cleaned, in some cases ripping out all the drywall or the plaster, so they don't have the same resources that someone that lost their building completely. But you get the sense, this is downtown Altadena. Not all of it looks like this, but a lot of it does now. Or this was the Will Rogers State Historic Park, immensely important in terms of completely destroyed, other than a few buildings. The cultural landscape's still there, but the buildings themselves are gone, and much of the artifacts were destroyed. Or a place like this is a National Register. This was the McNally house, so you know Rand McNally maps. This was the McNally house, also completely destroyed. Or the Zane Grey estate in Altadena, and this was our former board chair's house. Like I said to a group earlier today, they had just finished or were just wrapping up the restoration of this house. And this is a little different than most because the walls are still standing, and they are still exploring whether there's anything that they can save in terms of that. And also modernist buildings. This was a Richard Neutra, 1949, significant building. The Palisades, completely gone. But it's raising questions when I talked earlier about redefining heritage, redefining what does it mean about a place that's experienced so much loss and devastation. Does it still have heritage? We think it absolutely does. So it's about capital in terms of the people there. It's talking about community groups. It's talking about, in this case, Altadena has a really rich, important Black community in terms of why they settled there and the story that they have to tell and what they're wanting to do in terms of rebuilding their community as well. And also stories about, how the speculative development community is coming in already to snap up these properties for the people that don't have the insurance proceeds to rebuild. And so there's a lot of questions about how do you try to contain and also maintain those qualities that are important to these communities as part of a rebuilding effort. And there's some positives that have come from this in terms of community groups that have formed that didn't exist before to respond to this. There's an overwhelming sense across Los Angeles in terms of Angelenos being in this together. That's not how it was before. So people feel very strongly about that. Or even on the right here, this artist and a whole group of artists are doing these drawings for everybody that lost their homes, so they have something, because they have nothing in many cases, and that's meaningful. So lots of interesting things are happening. Or this example, the Bridges residence. We're working with the owner, who is the architect, Bob Bridges, who built this kind of a really interesting brutalist building from the 70s. The structure's still there. It could be put back together. So studying the concrete to make sure it's structurally sound in terms of that ability. So some things could be returned in terms of this work. And then the other piece to this is, again, fully documenting this. And that's where we come in. It's kind of our bailiwick in terms of our skill set. Again, this is a map of the city of LA. LA has been fully surveyed for historic resources. It's 880,000 parcels across the city. That's been done. So before the Palisades fire even started, we knew what was in the fire risk zone and what was at risk in terms of the fire as it was moving. For Altadena, very little survey had ever been done. So in many cases, we don't even know what was lost because it had never been identified beforehand. And so we're working with like the World Monuments Fund, the National Trust, and a cultural resource firm called Architectural Resources Group to do better documentation in terms of this. These are two maps we just completed as of a couple of weeks ago. They're up on our website that you can feel free to check them out in terms of the two burn areas. And to give you an example, this is the Altadena, so about half of the community burned. Completely up against the mountains around the foothills you see here. And if you zoom in on our map, you'll see all the properties in green are the ones that were damaged, destroyed. So you can click on any property, come up with the existing view, also the previous Google Street View in terms of this to do the GIS mapping in terms of this and understanding that. Our goal is to actually do a full documentation for the rest of the community as it's, because it's never been done, but to help in terms of the rebuilding and how do you knit this community back together in terms of that. And working with, again, lots of different community groups in terms of that. And it also brings up this question of climate change. As I said, we're not new to that game either, I don't think by any means in terms of heritage conservation. And this is an example that we dealt with last year. This was the Wayfarer's Chapel from 1951, Lloyd Wright design. The most special little glass chapel, if you had ever been to Rancho Palos Verdes. Land movement was happening at the end of last year underneath this building. So literally every week the land was moving about 9 inches, which meant this building of glass and wood was literally twisting apart. So the best preservation scenario in this particular case was to dismantle the building and find a new site to re-erect it. So it calls for us to come up with unorthodox or things we never would have thought of before to address how do you save a building when the land's literally moving underneath it and destroying it on its own. And then the last point I'll end on is this question of what's your why heritage conservation? It goes back to relevance, all the things I'm talking about. And I'll ask you this question, but I would encourage you to check out, if you haven't already, Max Page's book, Tom May's book, asking this question about why old places matter. Why it's a lot easier not to do this work for sure, but I don't think that's the right answer. And it gets this question, what's your why, helps you get to the how and the what. And that's everything that we do. Since I'm asking you this question, why heritage conservation, I will share my why. The reason I do this work is because of this place at 949 Shelby Street in Louisville, Kentucky. A very simple shotgun style house, nothing architecturally significant about this at all. But it goes back to the people and places. It's about the people that grew up here. It's about the stories that took place in this neighborhood, a neighborhood that has had ups and downs. It still looks very much as it did here in the 1940s and as it looks like there you see on the right today. But it's about the stories, and it's about the stories of this person and what she experienced in this place. And again, it's about connection. In terms of what old places help us do. They connect us to people, connect us to different places, connect us to history, help us understand. And this is what the house looked like probably in the late 30s, early 40s. This is what it looks like today. It's been a rental probably since the 1960s on vinyl, aluminum siding. This will never be a local landmark, but it's a local landmark to me because this is where my mom grew up. And this is a place that I grew up hearing about her stories, about her parents I never met, about this neighborhood, about this community, about this house. And every time I'm in Louisville, I have to drive by to make sure it's okay. Because it's the idea that these physical places, when you still have the physical place, you have a better sense of understanding the history, the story, the connection. Again, when the places are gone, it's less real. And so this is the reason I do heritage conservation, but I think it's for many people, it's very similar. Why people care about places is the connection it forms. And when they're gone, we lose it. So that's the reason why we're doing all this work, or hopefully why I'm here today. And again, it transcends us, being able to understand places. So with that, I will end. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was a wonderful discussion. We do have some time if some people have some thoughts or questions or comments that they'd like to ask. Or not. Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation. Really just beautiful images, and your narration of it was very compelling. So I'm just coming back from a national conference, and the big discussion is sort of the restructuring of federal monies for the built environment, and that there are certain words that are being, they're just doing Google searches to see if the words are in the grant application, and if they are, they're canceling the grants.
Yep.
A lot of the stories that you told involve issues that would now be canceled. Is this going to affect your work? To what extent are you reliant on federal monies? to what extent do you feel like the kind of history that's going to be able to be preserved might change at a time when certain topics are not able to be funded?
Yeah, I think it's a hugely relevant question right now because things are changing almost by the day in terms that we are not reliant on federal funding. We recently got a federal grant to do a National Register nomination for an African American neighborhood, and we're awarded that in early January. We're not sitting around waiting for the check to arrive anytime soon in terms of that. We expect that that won't happen. It's called the Underrepresented Communities Grant, and I'm sure that that's going to be flagged, and eventually that funding won't go forward for us and many grant recipients around the country. We've had this conversation, and we've spent a lot of time in the last 10 years really aligning our values and our goals and our priorities to talking about things around cultural diversity, inclusion, equity, all those kinds of things, the words that are now being scrubbed from so many other things at the federal level, and other entities like other universities are now, because they're getting funding, they know that they have to remove that. So I think it's a huge aspect in terms of when we talk about history and talk about whose history is going to be included, or stories. Even just the recent executive order around the Smithsonian. It's this is a different world in terms of that. But yeah, we're somewhat insulated, but we're not so naive to think that we may have some individuals or funders out there that may not want to continue because of the fear of where things are headed at the federal level. Yeah.
How are you funded?
We're privately funded, so like I said, we're a membership-based organization, so some of it comes from members. We raise all our money each year. We get some off of, it's not an endowment, but we get some interest income. But we do fundraising programs, some foundation support, but it's all private funding in terms of that. So that's where some groups like ours and others can continue doing this work. I also think, some states are going to be more immune to this than others, or resistant to that, and I would certainly put California into that. But yeah, it's a big issue in terms of nationally around heritage conservation and preservation about where are we in terms of this work, because it's changing very quickly.
Thank you.
Adrian, thanks for raising some of the issues around recent past, and particularly 60s and 70s, because some of that architecture is not loved, and some of it is grounded perhaps in the automobile era, which some folks would say, oh, just let it go, tear it down. So I thank you for raising some of the issues that, that these places, while they may not be revered now, you raised the point that even older neo-Gothic styles weren't revered in its time. Mm-hmm. So somebody thought it was ugly at a certain point, but then it becomes loved much later. And I think what's interesting about the last 10 years is how Instagram has actually connected young people to brutalism and given them an opportunity to appreciate it because it photographs really well, and learn to sort of love things that we kind of forgot about or kind of poo-pooed for about 20 years. So it's very interesting. Not only have young people reconnected with vinyl records, but they're reconnecting with an era of architecture in which it's somewhat distant from them. So can you comment a little bit about that further? Because we're facing this now in Columbus, Indiana, where not one, but two Saarinen churches now are seeking adaptive reuse because they're no longer churches. First Christian being one, and then North Christian being the second. So North Christian is being, First Christian is being preserved right now, and North Christian is going to be taken over by the Columbus Library. So what are some other kind of topics or issues that recent past preservation is facing right now?
Well, I think part of it goes to the long game, understanding these, like you were saying, understanding these places, and maybe it's like, a movie like The Brutalism, helps, even though everything it said was mostly wrong around architecture and the origin story of brutalism, but whatever, people started understanding it and maybe think about it. Or even, I look at this building differently than I used to, and I was walking around yesterday, walking through, I'm like, it's actually a really cool brutalist building. And I've been asking a couple of people today, do you think this is eligible as a historic place? And I'm like, So, it's changing perceptions. And one example I will use of that is, for those that know the Boston City Hall, which I think is one of the best examples of brutalism in the world. We were involved in around 2005 when the mayor and everyone was like, this has got to go, it doesn't work, it's also urban renewal, so it's got baggage attached to it, but hated the building. Around 2017, 2018, there were articles talking about it's the most beautiful city hall, and then this year it's designated as a local landmark. So in that span of time, people completely flipped in understanding this building. So I think that's part of it. But it is also this idea that, whether it's a building from the 1890s, 1930s, 1960s, 80s, because we should be talking about the 80s already probably, whether we're ready for it or not, they're incredibly adaptable for new uses, and we should be embracing that and finding those uses. So obviously churches are hard, but those buildings are beloved in those particular cases in Columbus, but why couldn't they take on an entirely new use? And we should embrace that.
Great talk, thanks. I'm the chair of Indiana Landmarks Historic Landscapes Committee, and I'm enduringly frustrated by Indiana Landmarks' inability to deal with historic landscapes in the same way that they deal with structures and buildings. You can't buy and flip a landscape very well, and that seems to be a pattern of not-for-profit preservation organizations. I'm just curious if landscapes are part of your interest area, and whether there's a good example of maybe cause for my optimism.
Yeah, we definitely deal with historic design or cultural landscapes. We're a different organization, Indiana Landmarks. We don't own anything, or we're not. It's just the real estate market is much different. But we're often advocating for cultural landscapes. It's different in terms of like how bringing the folks together, and also the idea that plants and things change over time, and how do you maintain that? But we work a lot with the Cultural Landscape Foundation and advocating for especially public plazas and spaces that are at risk, and where someone's coming forward and like, let's completely update this and not understanding it. Like there's the Grand Mall in downtown Los Angeles, and a lot of it has been redone, but we advocated for keeping that main 60s. It's this really wonderful fountain feature, and they originally were going to rip that out. Or there's a big plaza at Music Center in downtown Los Angeles that we've made some modifications, but again, maintain the integrity of that. And then there are some landscapes, which I would say Pershing Square is a good example in Los Angeles, right across the street from our office. It's postmodernism from the 1980s. In that particular case, we had no one standing with us. No one was like, yeah, we should keep that. And I think that's an example we'll look back on, and someone will go, why did we get rid of that? Because they just don't understand or appreciate it. A big purple tower with a round red ball in it, and not understanding what that is in terms of POMO architecture. But yeah.
With conservancy and preservation,
Where
how do
are
you
you?
see LA rebuilding as like preserving history within architecture while also trying to make it more fireproof too?
So like I said, there's lots of different. It's a great question. There's lots of different efforts underway. There's one. I'll give you examples of two. One that's happening mostly in the Altadena area in terms of rebuilding. It's called the Foothills Catalog Foundation. And essentially, they're dusting off an old idea of how do we just create some standardized designs for houses, kind of like catalogs, like back in the day in the teens and 20s, so that it's efficient in terms of homeowners won't have to hire an architect to build their new houses, hopefully more affordable, but it's also going to maintain those qualities that they're identifying in terms of the features that they want to see coming back in terms of infill residential architecture. Or a new effort that was just announced last week that is called Case Study Adapt. So LA came up with the case study house program in the 50s and 60s about innovative modernist homes, and architects coming up with very new ideas and materials in terms of how to use that. This is a new group of architects that's coming together about how to come up with new designs in terms of rebuilding, probably more in the Palisades area, in terms of this same idea that was the foundation for the case study house program, but also looking at more fire-resistant types of materials, the way we do overhangs, because part of the issue was the fires just kind of came up and then got into the attic spaces, and that's where some of the fires started. So if you have shallow eaves, maybe that's another approach. Just looking at lots of different ways in terms of the design, the materiality, as well as should we be planting a lot of shrubbery around our houses that will dry out and become essentially timber for fires. So it's looking at new ideas about that. So.
All right, so
Uh-oh.
in growing cities that are having a hard time balancing between preserving old buildings and building new high-rises, to gain some sort of a win-win compromise, how would you convince cities that you see developers buying old historic buildings that are on the National Register of Historic Places, but they're not local landmarks, and they want to propose new high-rises, and the city approves it without really any other consideration? How should we as preservationists really try to bring in some sort of win-win argument for maybe trying to preserve the building itself while adding something to it, or any other avenues?
We do that all the time. And I would say that's a core conversation that we're having with the development community, that will come in and say, this is my plan. And we're like, well, have you thought about, have you considered, did you look at, what about this alternative? And that starts a conversation and dialogue. One example I'll give you that I think speaks to this is the 1966 Century Plaza Hotel in Century City. It's this curved building, classic. It was kind of the West Coast White House. All the presidents stayed there, iconic hotel building. And it sold, and around 2009, the developer came forward, we're tearing down the hotel because we're going to build some towers for new housing. I think maybe office at that point, obviously that's not viable now. And so we came forward saying, well, wait a second, this is important, significant. And that started a dialogue where we looked at the site and we said, well, wait a second. You could keep the building, you could do your towers behind, we'd have enough space to do that. You could actually go up even higher, so greater density than what they were originally thinking about. Landmark the Century Plaza, get some tax incentives in terms of doing the adaptive reuse and taking advantage of the federal tax credit, so there's an incentive that otherwise they couldn't use, and that's what they did. And so it's finding that, like I said, drinking game, win-win, so that there's a way to do the density as well as preservation. And most cases, we have been able to point that out. It doesn't mean we're successful, depending on how the politics either work for us or against us, but usually there's a way to do it. And that's why all of you as design folks, having the ability to envision other ideas or approaches that can still achieve what they're doing. So I always say what we do is problem solve. And we manage the change, but it's about, okay, what are you trying to do? We'll figure it out.
Well, thank you very much.
Yep.
If there's any other questions, I see Adrian's got his email up there. I'm sure he'd be happy to entertain a note from you or a question.
Yep.
Thank you very much for spending the day with us here at CAP, and hopefully we'll get you back here again soon.
Yep, thank you so much.